Welcome to Bitcoin Fixes This, where we explore the impact that Bitcoin will have in all aspects of society. Today's guest is Mauricio Di Bartolomeo, CEO of Ledn. We talk about hyperinflation and his experience growing up in Venezuela. We also talk about how he got into Bitcoin and why he believes that hyperinflation is actually more political than we're led to believe. Mauricio, how's everything going?
It's going pretty well, man. How are you? It's great to be here. Great to chat with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, thanks for coming on. And, you have quite a remarkable story. And I really want to feature everything. But, I mean, where in the world are you right now and how's it over there?
I'm in Toronto at the moment. It's pretty nice. I mean, the weather is, it's Toronto. It's getting better. I was actually in Vancouver over the weekend, which was really exciting because I got invited to what was a real estate conference to talk about the mortgage. And I was basically, ourselves and Hive were the only two Bitcoin companies in the whole event. And it was great to be in a non-Bitcoin event for the first time in a really long time and see that there's still a lot of interest alive and kicking in the space for sure.
Wow. So you went to a real estate conference to talk about your products and stuff, which we'll definitely get to. But let's start sort of like with where you're from and everything like that, because sure. I find that whole story fascinating. Can you tell us about how you grew up in Venezuela?
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in Venezuela, which some might know, some might not know. I actually was born in a small town dead in the center of Venezuela called Barquisimeto. It was a town of 4 million people. And I read somewhere recently that when you ask somebody what the best time of their life was, they tend to mention a time when they were 10 years old, because apparently that is the sort of peak or one of the peak moments of your existence as a human. And I actually have a very beautiful memory of growing up in Venezuela, up until I would say the mid to late 90s, which is coincidentally when I started kind of, becoming more and more aware of the world around me. I was born in 85, and Hugo Chavez, the Venezuela, dictator or, ruler that many probably already know, he came to power in 99. So I was actually thinking back to my youth, and I actually was never really able to participate in a Venezuelan election that didn't have sort of communism on the ballot on some way or another, which was pretty fascinating. But I grew up in Venezuela, and listen, leading up to Chavez, Venezuela also had a lot of issues. And I don't necessarily like to subscribe to the idea that Chavez was the creator of all the problems Venezuela ever had. He certainly exacerbated it, and he created this really, just going back to my memory, what I remember distinctly was when Chavez came in, you started feeling a big divide in the population. He almost made it about you were either with him or against him. And everybody that was against him was just not as Venezuelan as those that were in favor of him. And so he came into power with I would say, a lot of enthusiasm around Venezuela, right? There was a lot of excitement when he first came into power. But some of the things he started to do right after, really, he started to kind of show his true colors very shortly after. One of the big red flags, which people ask me, hey, Mao, what in your mind are sort of red flags for these types of rulers? Like, when should we start getting worried? And I remember distinctly there was a massive turning point when he asked to rewrite the constitution. So Chavez actually rewrote the entire Venezuelan constitution. And it gave him superpowers. It extended his presidential term from 4 to 6 years. It enabled him to reelect himself essentially into infinity and change the name of the country, change the flag, change our chest of arms or coat of arms, change the name of the currency, the time zone. He changed a lot of things. He just wanted to basically make it known that it was his show now. Yeah, sorry, and I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but like as he was doing all of this stuff, that's when inflation really started just skyrocketing. And if I fast forward until when we got into Bitcoin, or when I get into Bitcoin, which is actually thanks to my youngest brother and my dad. So, I mean, should I give you the long story or the short story?
Well, so let's pause for a second, because you're growing up. And Chavez comes to power and he's changing all of that stuff. Why would he want to change stuff like the flag or the, time zone? Like the other stuff kind of makes sense. Yeah, you want to make sure that you can stay in power for a long time. But some of these other ones, they seem kind of pointless to me. What's going on there?
Oh, let me tell you, because there's beautiful stories behind all of them. Let's start with the coat of arms. So the coat of arms, the Venezuelan coat of arms had Simón Bolívar was I don't know if you're familiar with Simón Bolívar, but he liberated a lot of Latin America. So Colombia, Bolivia, Venezuela. And he was this great sort of liberator, and he has this great name. Many countries sort of hold him, particularly Venezuela and Colombia, hold him as the founding father. Okay. So his horse was on our coat of arms. And the horse was facing right. The face of the horse was looking right. Well, he flipped the horse so that the horse was now looking left, because that's where he thought the horse should be looking at. Okay. So that's why we flipped the coat of arms. Now let's go to the flag. Okay. The flag gets changed because he decides that there needs to be. So when Venezuela first got founded, okay, there were 7 provinces of Venezuela that decided to come together to join into one country, kind of similar to the US, right? Now he said that these 7 stars, which the Venezuelan flag has, were miscalculated, because it did not include a nation of indigenous people that were already in the country. So he changed the flag to add an 8th star to do this. Transparently, what everybody thinks he was trying to do, which is kind of reading between the lines, is to show anyone that opposed him in the country that there was essentially nothing he could not do, right? And it made a really good point, because as he did this in parallel, he also shut down, I have to go back to the exact number, but Venezuela had thousands of radio stations within his first year. I believe he shut down about 200 or 240 of them. Of course, all of those that did not tout his horn or were fully aligned with his party. And then the other thing he did was Venezuela had 2 major broadcasting companies, Radio Caracas Televisión and Venevisión. The most vocal against him was Radio Caracas Televisión. And of course, he shut down that network within 5 years. And just to kind of put it in context, it would be the equivalent of him coming on and literally shutting down NBC or ABC. Like it was that big. So, there's a lot of talk now here about, rich people getting involved in the media, or so-and-so controlling the media, or so-and-so influencing the media. Like, this would be like, if you were to put it on a spectrum, like, totalitarians, like, draft the posts and you know what I'm saying, and hire and they have complete grip of what gets put through the airwaves. Whereas here, I would say we are still in the sort of, very amicable stages, and sort of very, you still have a considerable amount of freedom of press, I would say, in Canada and the US.
Well, so like, how do you justify like just shutting down a broadcasting network? I mean, like, did he say it's for national security, or what was the justification, and why did so many people go along with it?
So the justification at the time was that they were not going to renew, they weren't going to shut it down. They never renewed their broadcasting license, which came into expiration, I believe. They have to renew it every 5 or 4 years or something. And once the account was up for renewal, they did not renew it. And I can't exactly recall what the legal grounds they had for not renewing it, but the fact remains, they didn't renew it. And I think the reality is that before he did all of this, right, he rewrote the Constitution. I have to check exactly when he changed the entire legal and court system. So he replaced all of the judges. And so by the time the Radio Caracas removal or license, he had already shut down, or not shut down, but fully taken over the country's largest oil production company. And when he was able to do that, because that was the sort of the crown jewel of Venezuela. That's what produced all the money. Like, to give you a sense, PDVSA, when Chavez took over, PDVSA is short for Petróleos de Venezuela, so the Venezuelan Petroleum Corporation. PDVSA was producing 3.5 million barrels of oil per day in 2002. Okay. Today, Venezuela produces 700,000 barrels of oil per day. So they've completely decimated the oil production company. And a lot of people thought, so first, his sort of sequence of events was, first he tried to take over the oil company, and he was successful. There was even an attempted coup. There was a big protest. People in PDVSA kind of walked out of their desks and kind of shut down the company for about a month, just protesting all the changes that he wanted to do. But he went ahead and did it anyway. And the funny thing about the commodity world is that when Chavez goes in and decimates one of the biggest oil production companies that were around in the world at the time, what did you think happened to oil prices? They skyrocketed because of supply concerns. And of course, this made his budget look even better. And so he basically said, no worries, we're going to be able to make do with all this extra revenue. Like, we're just going to bulldoze over all of you guys and make these changes because these are the changes the country needs. And I was just elected to do just this. And so and then people kind of start, at the beginning, people were questioning it. But of course, when you start doing the following trade, this is a very populist trade. So if you show up to a factory right now and you say to the people in the factory, guys, I know the owner is I know the owner is abusing you. I know the owner of this factory is taking a lot of profits home. And if we can take this from this guy and give it all to you guys, what would you guys say to that? And if you think about that from a political standpoint, the owner of that factory already didn't vote for you, most likely. And you are now turning the 500 people that work in that factory as sure votes. Right? And so this process, this sort of pure numbers game that comes with democracy can be abused. And he kind of figured out a way to do just that. And I think that that's why you were finding so much support, because people were just waiting and seeing, okay, well, when is he going to come break the piñata on top of us and we're going to collect all these goodies? Right? Because that was kind of the feeling that he was going to come in and kind of break up all these businesses and give them back to the people. And naturally, that can get a lot of people very excited. But they don't really think about the long-term effects of that.
So he basically used a lot of the oil revenue as a way to satisfy the population for some amount of time. And a lot of people, I guess, felt like they were getting ahead somehow or something like that.
100%. And to be very honest with you, Jimmy, the life of the average Venezuelan on the street, even though it was a mirage or an illusion, did get better. And I'm going to try to, in simplified terms, kind of explain how I see, the kind of forces that drove this. Is he comes in, he starts doing all sorts of, what I just mentioned to you, right? So the natural reaction of people that had businesses was to say, inflation is going to shoot through the roof. I am going to then either close my factory or significantly raise the cost of my goods such that they match production, right? Such that they match my cost of production, because the cost of importing things was getting very high very quickly, because everybody in Venezuela was leaving their bolívares and buying them for dollars. So as this exchange rate is skyrocketing, it becomes very difficult for a government to say that they have a great minimum wage. So, for example, if the Venezuela minimum wage is set in bolívares at 100 bolívares per month, and inflation goes to 1,000% for 3 months in a row, and your official exchange rate becomes 10,000 bolívares to $1, then your minimum wage is 10 cents, right? And so you can't have that, right? And so what Chavez did very quickly was he said, I'm going to create a currency control on the purchasing and selling of US dollars. So he fixes the exchange rate artificially low. He makes the exchange rate to be artificially low, in meaning that if you want to buy $1 from the government, you can buy it for 2 bolívares per dollar. Mm-hmm. But on the street, only a very select few can buy it from the government, right? But on the street, you could, the cost to buy the same dollar is 10 bolívares. So it costs you 5 times more. So by fixing the price, he basically removes the question of his minimum wage, right? Because he's going to set the price and it's not going to move. So he knows that he's going to have a great minimum wage to show these development agencies, right? And so what happens with the food producers? The food producers start saying, listen, you either give me those 2 bolivars per dollar so that I can import food and kind of keep it at the same price, or I'm going to have to basically skyrocket the price of food. So in essence, the same thing that happened with Elizabeth Warren when she said, I'm going to do a probe on turkey prices to when turkey prices were rising. It started in the exact same way. He says, I'm going to probe chicken producers because I think chicken prices are too high. Okay. And chicken producers meet with him and they say, Chavez, it's very difficult for us to put the chicken on the shelves at this price. And he says, well, I can do it. So why don't I buy your companies? Right? Like, here's a check so I can buy your companies. And they say, well, hold on, Chavez, like we can't really, let us try, right? They tried, they couldn't. So Chavez starts expropriating these chicken producers to essentially subsidize the cost of chicken and beef. So he starts expropriating chicken factories and farm and beef factories, etc., or farms. And he gives them to the workers. And he says, hey, workers, go ahead and start producing beef at lower prices. Okay. 2 months go by, the workers are unable to produce the beef at lower prices because guess what? You can't. And so he says, and then what happens is that you start seeing shortages of chicken, shortages of beef. And he immediately freaks out and he says, okay, you know what? I'm going to grab all of this oil revenue and I'm going to import beef from Argentina and chicken from Brazil, and I'm going to subsidize it, and I'm going to have the highest quality chicken and the highest quality beef in the supermarkets at subsidized prices. So all of a sudden, you start getting a flood of imported food into Venezuela that they are subsidizing. And of course, because he is in a great hurry to get everything stacked up, he starts getting very sloppy on all those contracts, right? And all of his friends start doing all sorts of corrupt deals to restock the shelves. So they're saying to the government that they're bringing chicken that costs $2 a pound, when in reality the chicken costs 25 cents a pound, and they're pocketing, more than 2 to 3 times the size of the contract or whatever, like a big third or 60 or 70% of the contracted amount is going through their pockets. And they start doing all these sorts of shady things. So what that ends up doing is you start favoring importers over producers. And people slowly started shutting down their factories and becoming importers and just asking daddy government for the subsidized exchange rate to import the chicken. Because when you got that, it made, 10 times the profits of you growing the chicken, actually, And so you turn the nation of producers into a nation of speculators and fiat loophole hunters, right? And of course, all of this subsidized food replacement works when oil is riding high and when the price of oil is 2 to 3 times what you had budgeted in the year before. But then all the party ends when oil starts crashing, right? And that starts happening around the same time as Chavez dies. And when Chavez dies and oil starts crashing, that's when really like all the sort of horrible things, not even worse things, started happening. Because first Chavez died and there was a glimpse of hope to get democracy back into the country. And I distinctly remember being in Canada and flying back down because I was so convinced that we were going to get our country back that I sold everything I had in Canada. I shipped my truck and a few things that I wanted to bring back home into a container, and I shipped everything back to Venezuela. And I flew down with my now wife to vote on that election with a big smile. I still remember the plane ride down. People were chanting and singing the Venezuelan national anthem on the plane, which was just incredibly inspiring. And we went in and we voted and we were winning. until 8 p.m. And then at 8 p.m., all of a sudden you start getting radio silence, rumors of, corruption at the voting centers, all the typical things that you hear. And then 11 p.m. that night or midnight that night, election official result comes out and we lost. The Communist Party magically wins again, even though all evidence pointed against it. From that moment, I realized that we had lost the country, that there was just no way we were ever going to get that back. And
what year was this?
This was 2014 elections. So Chavez died 2013. This is 2014. So almost 10 years ago now. And when this happens, I decided I had to go back to Canada. I couldn't stay in the country. But my family was reluctant to leave. They still had hope. So I was the only one that left. And all of my brothers stayed, my two younger brothers and my dad. And my youngest brother was just graduating university and he wanted to start a business. And my dad didn't really want him to start a business in Venezuela. He wanted him to leave. So my brother kept pitching. My dad used to give us a little seat check when each of us graduated so that we could go and kind of take our swing at the bat. We were a very entrepreneurial family. And when it was my youngest brother's turn, my dad kept saying, these are all too risky. Let's think of different things. And among his sort of pitches, his last pitch, his sort of most emphatic pitch, saying kind of like this is it, guys. If you don't agree to this, I'm just going to leave. I'm just going to run away from home and do this on my own. And the pitch was mining Bitcoin. And my dad, I was in Canada at the time. My dad emails me like a few links and he was like, hey, can you take a look at this? What do you think? Your brother just sent me this. And I took a look at it. And to be very honest with you, like when I first read the white paper and started getting to understand what Bitcoin was, it didn't really blow my mind like many people say it does, because I just thought of it as an interesting concept that it would be an interesting attempt for him, because as I understood it, we could get the ASICs from China, and then the energy, which was the big input, was heavily subsidized in Venezuela, and so was the internet. And so high level, I said, give it a shot and let's see what happens. And this was around summer 2014-ish. And I flew back later that year for Christmas. And my brother was smiling ear to ear when all of my friends were looking to leave the country. And what I asked him, I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm mining Bitcoin. I'm like, okay, sure, buddy. Like, show me, what are you really doing? Right. And he's like, no, let me show you. He takes me to his facility. I see a bunch of computers, a lot more than what he originally had bought. And he says, I'm like, show me. He says, give me your bank account details. I'm like, I give him my bank account details. He sends the Bitcoin to an exchange called Cert Bitcoin, which was working at the time, but they've since, one of the guys is in jail, unfortunately. The exchange worked better than all exchanges. I mean, a lot of exchanges here today, because the cash hits my account within an hour. And at that moment is when I just went all down the rabbit hole. It's like that's when all the light bulbs went off. And I said, if my brother can turn Bitcoin into fiat in the most treacherous, most hostile economic environment in the planet, and the machines are coming from China, and the development is being done in North America, and the developers and the community and a lot of the sort of devs are in North America, like this is a truly global phenomenon. And then from that moment, I couldn't stop thinking about Bitcoin, and that I still haven't till today.
Okay. Wow. So a lot to cover there, but let's go backwards a little bit and talk about how inflation became such a big problem over there. Obviously, the effects of it are very clear. Essentially, as you said, the domestic production all left and everyone became a speculator on the import-export business, and a lot of rent seeking and stuff like that. But why did inflation become such a big problem? What was the sort of trigger for the bolivar losing so much value against the dollar?
So I've made this comment before, and I really do believe in it. I think inflation is an economic phenomenon, and I think hyperinflation is a political phenomenon. People tend to think of hyperinflation as an extension of inflation, as some really bad inflation. But I would actually challenge that they are two different problems. because inflation, I see it as just a rational actor's reaction to an increase in the monetary supply, right? Like if you look at North America, monetary supply increased by, call it 50% or 60%. Roughly, that's what asset prices increased by, right? Same in Canada, kind of same in sort of modern democracies, right? They've adjusted to the new monetary base, right? Mm-hmm. What happened in Venezuela was that at the beginning, it starts as an adjustment of the monetary base, right? Mm-hmm. But if you lose all sort of confidence that these people will ever be able to put a lid on this issue, which is what happens in Venezuela, right? Because when you see inflation through the roof, but then you see the constitution got restructured. This guy has now unlimited terms. He's taken over the top oil producing company in the country. He's basically eliminated the freedom of press. He's basically bullied the country into a new name. Oh, did I tell you he changed the name of the country also?
You did, but okay. It wasn't clear what the name change was.
It was from Venezuela to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Huh? And so once you have done all of this, if you are an actor in the world of capital and you have the option to invest that capital elsewhere, the rational view in light of all of those events is to run, right? Right? Yeah. And that's exactly what they did. And it starts out as this gradual process of orderly sales into dollars. Mm-hmm. But then what happens is the government catches on to this and they say, okay, guys, no more dollar sales unless they come from me, right? And naturally, they don't sell you the dollars, right? So what happens is that people start being resourceful and start trading and finding their counterparties in society. So you are a Venezuelan, Jimmy, that has dollars and need bolívares, and I am a Venezuelan that needs dollars and has bolívares. So I will send you bolívares to your local bank account, and you will send me dollars from your US account to my US account. And that creates the market for dollars. The only honest and open market for dollars in the country, therefore, becomes that, not what daddy government sells you if you're their buddy, right? Like the real market price is what's determined in what's called the black market, okay? Now, the black market reacts really fast, and there are a lot more risks in the black market because you are not settling with a bank. You're doing a transaction that your local regulator is not going to be able to help you on if anything goes wrong. And so the price premiums and the spreads start widening a lot. And it's very spotty. These markets are very spotty. So the black market, this idea that you can no longer buy dollars freely, makes dollars even more desirable. and this is the perfect example of bad money drives out good money. And the context of this saying is that so in Venezuela, bad money would have been US dollars, right? Because the government has deemed them to be bad money, right? But in fact, they are not. They are the best money. The government is deeming them bad because it's bad for them, right? But in fact, and what happens is inevitably, the bad money is what ends up driving their good money out because everybody wants dollars at that point. Nobody wants bolívares at that point. And now inflation, every time Chavez, and I'll tell you kind of what created these super waves of inflation. So like every time Chavez, at least in my mind you, this is just my personal opinion, but like when Chavez went out and expropriated one chicken factory or one chicken farm, every other chicken farm in Venezuela was like, okay, we got to start liquidating assets. We got to start taking firing our staff, looking for places in Florida. Like, and so it creates these waves of exit, right? Of like, everybody's just exiting. Their capital is just running away. And that's really what you are seeing. You're seeing, and the government, instead of saying, hey guys, no, instead of doing things to make the capital feel less worried or less concerned, it is actually like creating ramps for them to leave, right? Like it wants the capital to leave because Chavez knew very smartly that as this money left, so would the people that controlled that money, because they would want to be close to their money. And so to him, it's actually brilliant because it drained the resources and the brains from his opposition. It sent them to a different country, right? Like he had this program that I later found out the strategy behind it. And I was a pawn. I was a pawn in this program. And let me tell you why. When I graduated high school, I was dying to get a great, go to the best university that I could, attend. And that I knew that was going to be in Canada or the US. And Chavez also wanted all bright people that could potentially be revolutionary or potentially be impactful. He wanted them to leave because he wanted them to make it abroad and never come back. Does that make sense? So he actually subsidized people to go to, not subsidized, but he offered this official exchange rate to people that wanted to go study abroad. And because I was a Venezuelan that got accepted into a school that was abroad, a university abroad, I was actually able to use this program. And I am here now, right? I left. I am no longer in there. I am not his opposition. I am not fighting. I have way too much to lose. I'm fighting from Canada, right? And I would argue that his strategy worked because a lot of the people that were in my cohort that would have been avid opponents of his plan are all gone. Mind you, a lot of it is because it became a matter of like it would threaten our physical safety, right? And that's why I think a lot of people made the call. When you start seeing people get shot in protests and people get jailed for years unfairly, you start asking yourself some really hard questions. And that sometimes the result of that or the outcome of that is that you just have to leave. So,
wow. Well, so essentially, I think what you're saying is like hyperinflation is sort of like a side effect of his political program, which was to essentially drive out a lot of his political opponents from the country so that he could have more dictatorial power. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, it was like a war on private capital. You could think of it that way. Like he thought of his opponents as anything that had to do with capital and anything that had to do with, any semblance of property rights or anything that wasn't a commune, was not part of his plan. And that was a bit surprising because his original platform was a middle of the road person. But when he came into power, he just went full out Marxist, which was what scared a lot of people. Rightfully.
So
right?
And that led to a lot of capital flight, which changed the exchange rate. So let me just make sure I understand what you're saying. So there's a normal monetary base inflation, but what you were saying is there was also a hyperinflation that was political because a lot of people felt threatened by the sort of like takeover of various industries, and that capital flight was what made the hyperinflation really go. Is that right? And then Did that lead to like multiple more money printing as a result because they couldn't afford anything, or what happened like to perpetuate the hyperinflation cycle?
Yeah, so it's a cycle. It's a cycle of this continuous, people in the country, continuing to wanting to protect their capital, and it's a cycle, right? It's almost like a. So to your point, once all of the capital goes away and all the factories are closed, you have no internal production apparatus, right? Like there is just no way for you to produce more chicken or to produce more beef, right? The only way you can do that is you either have to recapitalize your banking system so they can lend to your agricultures and producers and kind of jumpstart them again, or you have to print money to like acquire the producers directly. Either one of them has an inflationary impact, right? And that's exactly what they ended up having to do. Now, layer on top of this a couple of things that assisted to this hyperinflation theory. One, the complete collapse of the oil production industry in Venezuela gradually. Every month we would produce less and less oil, less and less oil, less and less oil. Because of that, the oil revenues that were coming into the government, and therefore the dollars that were available to sell back to the population, were every time less. Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
there was less of them to go around, driving more and more people increasingly to the black market, which bid up the black market even faster, right? So you had, a few sort of trends layering into that. And on top of that, every time you had an election cycle, things would turn even worse. So like, instead of the system becoming more open, like, for example, like I'll give you the case of Argentina, right? Like Argentina went into a leftist government, right? And was able to switch back to a right-wing government from Mauricio Macri, like the last term. Then it switched back to a left-wing government, like they're right now with Fernandez. And there's a good chance, from what I'm hearing, that the sort of right group will win back again. Well, that pendulum, that ability for the pendulum to swing from one party to another, the pendulum broke in Venezuela. It stayed to the left, basically. Like, it was never allowed to come back. And every time we were close to an election cycle, it would become even more real that it was never going to come back. Does that make sense? And so there was a lot of things that play into the hyperinflation element. So what I was trying to say is that it's not just a rational reaction to an increase in the money supply, basically.
There was a political program that was underneath it all, which is absolutely fascinating. So this election that happened after Hugo Chavez dies, and you think you're about to elect somebody, and then everything sort of just changes all of a sudden, and you get radio silence, and somehow the wrong guy wins. At that point, what's the reaction in the country, and like how many more people leave, and what does the Bolivar do at that point?
Yeah, so that was, well, let's start with the feeling. The feeling was a punch in the gut. Like it was just a collective like from the entire nation. As I told you, I remember distinctly the plane ride into Venezuela for that election, and I will never forget the plane ride out either. It was like everybody on that plane had a relative that had died. And that's how you can oh man, this is hard. That's like the probably the cleanest way to put it is a part of you or a part of your family just dies, because you're never going to see that part again. So I don't want to get too downer, but the collective feeling in the country was that we were done. That was it. And that actually started the massive exodus out of Venezuela. The exodus out of Venezuela starts in around 2014-15. Let me just Google here, Venezuelan Exodus. But yeah, the Venezuelan Exodus, here's the Wikipedia entry. Since 2015, yeah. So 2015 is when it really kind of kickstarted it. The election was in 2014. People had to sort of, in 2014, the immediate reaction after that election happens was, what am I going to list my assets for? What's my house worth? What's my car worth? And what can I get in Panama or Florida with that money? That's sort of the immediate switch. And everybody started talking about where they were going to leave, like which country they were going to go to, how hard it was to get a visa here, how hard it was to get a visa there, who do you know here, who do you know there? And everybody starts listing their assets for sale in Venezuela in around 2014, 2015. Inflation skyrockets. At that point, it starts getting really, really bad. And everybody starts trying to liquidate all of their assets. So two things start happening, which adds to insult to injury. The price of your assets in dollar terms is getting destroyed because you are trying to sell your assets for every time more bolivares, but the inflation is just, you just cannot fight it. Right. And so even though your asset price is going astronomically higher in bolivares, in dollar terms, it's actually less and less every time. And people start getting really disheartened because the trade flow is as follows: Miguel wants to sell his car, Miguel wants to sell his bolivares, his car and his house, and he gets a bunch of bolivares for it. Then he has to go buy dollars. And the flow is very much one way because everybody's looking to get rid of bolivares for dollars, but very few people are looking to basically buy bolivares with dollars. Does that make sense? And so the liquidity on that side is so thin that it just rides up the price. Anybody with dollars will say, I'm going to name my price to let go of this dollar, right?
Mm.
and they get all the pricing power. And so that naturally drives up the rate, helps drive things even faster. And this is exactly around the time period where my brother starts mining Bitcoin. And the contrast was so crazy to me because I had friends on one end telling me that they were literally shutting down their factories and they were going to basically rent their apartment to their cousin because they didn't want to sell it at the prices that they could get at the moment. And I had my brother on the other side asking me, hey, do you know any of your friends that are closing down factories? I'm looking for some extra power. and he was the only person looking for this extra power. Everybody else was sad, disappointed. And that's why the juxtaposition of the two was so crazy to me, where some of my friends rightfully felt like they were doomed. My youngest brother and his buddies felt like they had found El Dorado, and it was crazy different. And of course, I sided with the El Dorado guys, because I very much got into their camp once I understood what they were doing, and that's why. So fast forward into that, like Mario and I, my brother Daniel, like all of us, and even my family, we weren't the only ones that benefited from Bitcoin, because when this started happening, people started finding out about Bitcoin and about mining in Venezuela. And slowly the desperation out for leaving into a few people turned into, okay, I think I can figure out, a way to make some money here, or at least protect myself in a way that I'm not desperate to leave the country. If I could just shelter some of my assets and produce some Bitcoin and do this in a smart way, I have found a way to produce, or to extract value in a way that I have a decent life. It's not as desperate anymore. It was literally like a life rack, like a way of mining was a way of creating income through a subsidized hydro and subsidized internet. So mining was a way of monetizing the Venezuelan subsidy into your personal balance sheet, if that makes sense. Right? Because you would use their subsidized power and their subsidized internet to power your machine, and you would get a full price Bitcoin. And so you were in many ways, you are monetizing their subsidy. And this is why so many countries that subsidize energy have a big issue with mining. It's because they don't want to let you know what the real price of energy is,
Well, so a lot of parallels here. You have this very depressing situation where it feels like a relative just died. And yet in the midst of that, there's this huge beacon of hope in like Bitcoin mining, because that's a way for people to essentially be able to store their wealth, which they couldn't do. And it was politically expedient for the government to essentially eliminate a lot of the opposition through this program. I mean, it kind of reminds me of like the last 2 years where like the people holding Bitcoin are the only people that are actually like optimistic. Everybody else is just like completely depressed because of the global pandemic and all the restrictions around it and something like that. Do you see that, or is it? I'm sure it was a lot worse, but like when you look back on that time and look at what's happening in the Western world over the last couple of years, like what's your take on it, given your background?
It's a good question. My takeaway from this is, one of the main takeaways is that there's always a green sprout or something to be optimistic about somewhere. You might not be working on it right now, but someone somewhere is working on some really cool stuff with a very, very exciting future. And what I see, even if we step back from Bitcoin for a second, like when I have conversations with people around me, I think I see people in sort of two camps, right? Like one is you are either very aware of the driving forces behind an economy and you have a pretty good understanding of what inflation is and how it can impact you. And by understanding that, then you start looking at the world in almost like in slow motion, right? Because you say, okay, the Fed has to do this. The Fed has to stay within these inflation targets. These are the levers that they can pull. They're likely going to raise rates to bring down asset prices. And so people that understand inflation and understand how the different grinds of the economic wheel connect, they are typically optimistic because they can position themselves in a way that, if the market plays out in the way they think it will, they're not going to be too bad, or they might even benefit, right? I think people that are there are a lot of people that live, that go about their lives and have no clue how money works. Like, just they don't know. They're told, hey, go do your job. Don't think about it. Just get paid. Put it in some RSPs or some 401ks and just buy some indexes and you'll be fine, right? And when you're sort of kind of told, hey, no, don't worry about money. Like, you don't really have to worry about how that works. The problems of the world are caused by something else. And when you take that lens of the world, then you will think that the world is full of problems and they're so hard to fix, and that. But what a Bitcoiner or somebody that I think has a very good understanding of how the monetary pieces work, you kind of see everybody's incentives more clearly, right? And you say, okay, well, sure, markets might be going down because the Fed overdid the printing and now they have to, act like a big guy and saying they're going to raise the rates into infinity. But everybody knows that, the market's going to break if they do that. So there's going to be a limit to how far they can do that. And so a lot of people are already tired of thinking down to the next cycle, right? It allows you to think in longer and longer time frames, which is, I think, is low time preference, right? Like, what I think inflation does is that it gets you, and this is what I think the Fed is so worried and petrified of inflation, because I can tell you something we didn't get into, but something I noticed in Venezuela as inflation was increasing is that at first you are okay with a deal that gets you your money back in 12 months. A little bit later, you're looking for a return on 9 months because it's so high. Then a little bit later, you want a return in 6 months. And does that make sense? And then the longer the time that you're willing to expose your capital gets compressed and compressed and compressed as inflation goes higher. And as we know, that yields into more and more short-term projects, which typically have, inferior deliverables than long-term projects. And I think that the Fed is just trying to really break this idea that we can get into hyperinflation, right? Like, they're really just trying to cap it, because even though, a dip in the market is dangerous, the potential of this idea being perpetuated is even more dangerous. And so I think that's why they're doing everything they can to just handicap this, even if they have to do a recession.
Wow. So essentially, like, there's a political component to all of this, which I didn't really consider with respect to inflation, that oftentimes it's very useful for the people in power to continue inflation for their political program or to hurt their opposition or something like that. It kind of reminds, like, the other thing that, as you were talking, that this situation reminded me of is kind of like New York and California. All the conservative people have pretty much, like, a lot of them have left, right? Because of the sort of very extreme policies that they put in place, especially around COVID. That sounds like what happened in Venezuela. Like, there was a lot of people that would have probably opposed, a lot of the policies and stuff, but instead they all left because it was more expedient for them to do so. And they basically voted with their feet. People like yourself who went to Canada instead of, staying. Like, do you see that dynamic playing out a little bit more going forward because of Bitcoin and because there's this ability to vote with your feet a little bit more?
100%. And in fact, I think that's going to be the net benefit, or one of the big net benefits of Bitcoin to the world, is that as your capital becomes easier to move and harder to restrict, governments, I believe, are going to have to step into a strategy of wanting to lure in the Bitcoiners rather than threatening the Bitcoiners. So, like, for example, I think if you look at the ability, so it's sort of a layered point that I wanted to make, but like the first one is, to talk about the ability to hurt countries. So the thing with Venezuela is that, do you remember the sort of Richard Branson party with Shakira at the borders, and they were trying to bring food and aid, and Maduro closed the bridges with trucks, with container trucks. I don't know if you remember.
I remember that image, but I didn't know that it was because of Shakira or Richard Branson.
So there was a big rally to bring humanitarian aid into Venezuela by way of medicine and food, and the trucks came. There was the Human Rights Foundation. There was a huge number of humanitarian groups involved, and what ended up happening was they got to the bridge. Maduro shut down the bridges, did not let the aid come through. And then notwithstanding that day he shot like 102 innocent people in Venezuela during the protests that day. And the TVs went silent and nobody heard of that again. and of course we had all these sanctions that came through. Remember, Venezuela got sanctioned to the nth degree, and which brings me to the other point, which is who's going to help Venezuela? Like the Venezuelan regime is essentially a straight up dictatorial regime with known ties to drug dealing, and our president is a wanted criminal by the United States, and so is sort of his entire cabinet, and he's been ruling the country for 10 years now. Who's going to help Venezuela? Right? Like if you were in the shoes of a Venezuelan person that is looking for democracy and hoping that this crazy Marxist rule is ever going to go away, your only hope is to leave. And the one thing I want to say is that there is a risk of this opt-out idea. This idea of voting with your feet, Jimmy, that you mentioned, is actually it's a double-edged sword in my view, because in the current time where there is no global police and there is no global way of enforcing a bad actor that is sovereign. So and the examples I want to give you are Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, Iran. Those are, in my view, those are lost states. They are states that have no democracy. There is no international desire to go free them or save them. And their leaders are corrupt military officials. And so if you are a person in that country, this is something that I had to really question, because a lot of people were like, "Oh, Mao, you could have been such a great politician in Venezuela. Why don't you just start and get your?" And you are going up against somebody that has all of the resources, all of the guns, no checks and balances, and no international oversight. Who do you think is going to win? So what do? You exacerbate inflation and get the F out. Like that's why I keep going back to this idea of it's really a political issue. And one of my concerns, frankly, is that this concept of opting out is easy, frankly. But my concern is that if we extrapolate this opting out principle and we start opting out of the last free countries or systems that are left, then when we opt out, what the hell are we going to opt into after that? Right? And so that's why I'm being pretty vocal these days, in that we as Bitcoiners need not be afraid of politics. We need to be very much involved, because I don't think they're going to go away. And the other thing, having experienced what I experienced in Venezuela, is that I also don't think that, for that same reason, I don't think that fiat will go away either. Because I think that the monopoly on violence that governments have is ultimately the most powerful force to drive behavior. And we just haven't seen that, right? But if you go to a country like Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, those people have decades of experience to understand how inflation hurts them, and infinity of reasons to not use their local currencies. But they still do. And they still do because at the end of the day, the end bully of your physical world will coerce you into doing so. And that's a pretty powerful force. Yeah, and sorry, it's a bit, it's a bit contrarian, I think, to some of the thoughts out there, but I'm happy to debate.
It's very interesting because I think what you're describing is this dynamic of people opting out of crappy places and the crappy places getting crappier, rather than like I mean, obviously, if you're leaving for somewhere and those other places continue to get better because the best and the brightest are going there, and what it seems like to me, the kind of world that you're describing as people vote with their feet is one where you have like kind of extremes, right? You have, the libertarian paradise with lots of free markets and things like that, and then you have communist, like regimes that essentially completely oppress their people. Maybe some of those people leave, but it's hard to get people to leave, and it takes a lot of time for things to get bad enough for where people are willing to get out of the country. That dynamic, like at some point feels kind of inevitable. And you almost see that in the US already, where, like people get out of the states that have, more restrictions towards the other states, which have less restrictions and stuff like that. But like California and New York are way more liberal now than they were before, because a lot of the people that are more conservative have essentially left. So that seems to be the dynamic. Am I wrong? Like, is that what's going on in Venezuela?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Now, the challenge is that freedom of mobility, that ability to move from California to Texas or from New York to Florida, that's great if you're all part of the same system. But I'll tell you what happens. The first Venezuelans that leave, sure, they're able to pick. But by the time the millionth Venezuelan wants to leave, you're now dealing with a humanitarian crisis and nobody wants to take in those Venezuelans. And you cannot leave. And that is effectively what's happening today. If you hold a Venezuelan passport today, that's very much a liability right now. And, when was the last time you ever had somebody in your course that says, "Oh, my family left North Korea 2 years ago. We're happy here now in the U.S. resettling"? Like, you don't hear those stories. They don't leave. Same with a lot of Cubans. Like, sure, you still see rafts coming in every once in a while, but they're not as many as they used to be. And so, to your point, you get this sort of full capitulation in some of these countries, and then the sort of creme of the crop that was able to leave those countries typically goes to the freest countries. And I think this is why the sort of US population keeps getting these sort of renewed antibodies of this type of attack every time these crises happen. Right now, you got a flood of Venezuelans and Cubans built Florida. Puerto Ricans helped build New York, Texas and California were almost built half by Mexicans. You know what I mean? Like we're a country where every time something happens, these are the beacons of freedom, right? And then when I start hearing people talk about opting out of the beacons of freedom, I'm like, damn, I don't know what they're opting into, but they better have a plan. And so that's really it, right? And I'm pleased to see sort of more lobbying efforts and sort of us as a community kind of growing up and being able to sit down with regulators and tell them why mining is not going to end the environment and why it makes sense to create jobs and why having a Bitcoin company in a particular state helps you as a governor and the people that live in that state. It's I think it's part of our inevitable growing up.
Well, that's really interesting. That like there is this like very interesting effect of a lot of these immigrants, the best and the brightest, essentially building up these places. And even going further than what you were talking about, like a lot of the European immigrants to the US in the 1800s, they were being oppressed in their home country as well, or they were looking for opportunity and things like that. And they built a lot of the country as well. So it is very sobering to be reminded that most governments can be extremely tyrannical, and that in turn causes a lot of productive people to leave. But the places that they come from can be, it doesn't tend to turn around very easily, at least without some violence or something like that.
That is absolutely it. And at some point, unfortunately, the internal balance of the two parties can get thrown out of whack, right? And so, it's almost at this point impossible for the Venezuelan right, the center right, anything other than Marxist party to win anything, because the party in power. So this is actually what happens in both Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. The parties that are currently in power are so doomed that they know the second another body gets democratically elected, they're going directly to jail. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, they are not motivated to let anything democratic happen, right? And naturally, what is the other option? Well, somebody should come in externally and say, hey, guys, you're bullying one side of your community. Please have democratic elections, right? Which is what the approach is today. And Maduro turns around and says, that's cute, guys. What are you going to do about it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? And what do you do about it? Do a party? Try to send some food aid trucks? Oh, that didn't work? Okay, well, too bad, guys. Okay, well, we'll come back in a few years. And what does that say to the Maduro party? It's like, oh, well, you guys are never going to come in here, so I'm just going to keep killing innocent people.
Wow. So optimistic there. No,
sorry, no, it's a cynical in me, but yeah, I've just been through a lot of years of this time is different. We're going to help you. You're not alone, Venezuela. You're not alone. We heard them all.
So let's talk about, your work in Bitcoin, because obviously the reality of inflation and hyperinflation and, like voting with your feet and all of these things are very familiar to you. Tell me about your startup and what you're doing and what you're hoping to achieve with it.
Yeah, thank you. So when I got into Bitcoin and I started mining with my brothers and family, we made a big mistake, which was instead of keeping all of our Bitcoin, we would reinvest it into more ASICs. And if you remember back in the day, ASICs had a delivery timeline of about 9 months, 6 to 9 months, and you had to pay them all in Bitcoin. And of course, if you reinvested a Bitcoin in, early 2015 and you spent the money at that Bitcoin price, but then you received your goods 9 months later and you had to mine the Bitcoin at a new difficulty and at a new price, essentially we would lose all of the appreciation in those 9 months. And time and again, we realized, we really wanted to make more Bitcoin, but the way that, we got too excited, which is we thought the best way to do that was to buy more ASICs. But the reality was that the answer was that you should have never sell your Bitcoin, right? Like borrow against it. Do not sell it. Like do anything you can, but just don't sell it, right? Because the appreciation and the opportunity cost of selling it is too high. So I helped a lot of people set up mining facilities and help a lot of people that were doing with Bitcoin businesses. And whether you had Bitcoin revenue, whether it was for a brokerage or a mining business, you had the same issue. All you had was Bitcoin revenue, but you had to invest fiat to grow the business. And every time you did that, Bitcoin just ripped and you lost the upside. And what I wanted and what many of my friends wanted was just somebody to lend us dollars backed by Bitcoin so that we wouldn't have to sell our Bitcoin. And to our surprise, banks didn't think Bitcoin was an asset, so they weren't lending anything to us based on it. And there was one more shop offering something similar, but you had to have a token and you have to stake the tokens and the interest was paid in tokens. There was some weird tokenomic situation with like a ICO attached to it. And we came from structured finance. And our view was that, if we were going to be in the business of lending, we needed to be able to access the cheapest cost of capital. And the cheapest cost of capital typically comes from these hyper-regulated insurance companies and pensions and banks. And to interact with those companies, you have to basically be able to sit down at their table and you have to be able to have a compliant offering that they're not going to be nervous of interacting with. And so we thought that over the long term, it was strategically going to be much better for us to not have a token, not to mention there was a huge risk of them being unregistered securities, hint, hint. And so we said, we are going to do a very boring company, a company that does not have a token, that only deals with Bitcoin loans, or Bitcoin-backed loans, and that is just going to be our product. It's going to be one product, Bitcoin-backed loans, and we're going to do that better than anyone else. And we set out to do the first Bitcoin-backed loan in Canada. And in November 2018, after we raised a small seed round, we did just that. We underwrote the first Bitcoin-backed loan in Canada, which went actually to Francis Pouliot at Bills. And that kind of got us introduced to the community. And then from there on out, Canadian businesses and miners started using our services. But from the beginning, I was always really excited to bring this product to Latin America because I knew there were so many people down there that never had been able to access a mortgage because they had never been able to own an asset. But for the first time now with Bitcoin, they could borrow from a Canadian company because now they had an asset that we could take as collateral. Until Bitcoin, you could not do that from Venezuela or Colombia or anywhere in the world. No Canadian lender was going to take comfort in your Mexican vehicle or property, right? But with your Bitcoin, it changed the game completely. And so we worked very hard to create all of our services in Spanish and started working really hard with a bunch of educators down south that we still work with today. Our strategy has been that we find who we think is the best educators in the Bitcoin in that market, and we set up these very, very long-term relationships with them. I believe every single one we started working with, we still do work with today. And that started getting people to understand the product. Our products, our loans start at $500, which a lot of companies that were in this business have loans that start at $10K, $20K. And to me, there's no way a person in Latin America is going to test a product that they've never used and they need 20 grand of collateral to use it. It was just too out of reach. And so it was very difficult to build the tech and the servicing such that a $500 loan was profitable at the rates that we charged, because we charged really great rates. But we did it. And the behavior we saw was exactly that. When Latin American clients came in, took a $500 loan, understood the disbursement time, the processes, how to pay it back, how the product works, what potential risks there are with it. And then they would come back for a bigger loan and then a bigger loan. And that thesis is, our thesis from day one was that this product, as Bitcoin became the reserve, the reserve asset for many people around the world, our loans were going to become the equivalent of the mortgages, right? As in North America, most of your value is trapped in your best asset, which is your house, and you take a mortgage or a home equity line of credit against it. Our product was going to be the equivalent of that for the equivalent of people's homes, which would be Bitcoin globally. So that was the thesis of the startup. And then we lend, today we lend to clients in over 125 countries. We've lent over $500 million to them. We've raised over $100 million from some great investors, including Alan Howard and Alexis Ohanian and Parify and a bunch of other great names. But to me, the coolest thing is we've built an incredible team. Many Venezuelans work in our team, which fills me with pride. Many Venezuelan expats that were in similar positions as I did, they had to leave the country for whatever reason, and they relocated to Spain or Canada. We worked with a ton of them here, and they're incredibly excited to be here. And, that's one of the coolest things about working in a Bitcoin company is that people feel this sort of excitement. It's like putting on the Ledn shirt. It's like you're putting on a soccer team's jersey. You know what I mean? Like it's like you're playing on the field. I remember, Jimmy, actually, and I'm gonna date myself and fanboy here for a second. I used to listen to you way back because you've been around for a really long time, and I would watch you and Francis and all the guys that were at the early conferences. And I saw you guys, and I swear to you, I would look at you guys as if you were like the LeBrons or, you know what I mean? Like the Hardens. Because it was like, that's what you do for a living. You Bitcoin for a living, And to me, I still have to pinch myself when I say I work in Bitcoin. That's what I do for a living. Because I think it's an immense privilege, and I get to work with people from all over the world thanks to it. So.
Well, that sounds really cool, and it is interesting that you can target, places outside of Canada because the collateral is pristine. You can do loans against it. Are there people in Venezuela that are taking some of these loans, and how are you able to get them dollars, and what's the deal?
So no, it's a great question, and so I guess the answer is yes. So Depending on the loan product, but between 40 to 50% of all of our loans go to Latin America. So Latin America is by and large the place of the world where we lend the most into. And so, yes, to your first question, there's a lot of people in Latin America that use these products. The question on how you get them dollars is a very interesting one, because when the products first started out of the gate, some clients would have bank accounts in dollars in places like Panama or sometimes even the US. But increasingly, we started hearing from clients that they needed local currency to pay debt or do whatever. And at first, they asked us to send the disbursements of the loan in Bitcoin. And we were like, well, you're putting Bitcoin as collateral. Are you sure you want us to send the disbursement in Bitcoin? And they're like, yes, our local P2P markets are so deep, it'll be much quicker for me to convert it into fiat if you send it to me in this. And frankly, I don't have a dollar bank account to get the transfer into. And we were like, okay, that makes sense. We'll send it in the Bitcoin equivalent. And then we started getting a flood of requests for stablecoin disbursements. And it started becoming increasingly more popular across the board, all over LATAM. And inevitably, we got the question, or we started getting the requests to set up savings accounts in stablecoin format, because as incredible as having Bitcoin is, when your whole net worth is 10K and it can move 10, 20% in a day or a week, naturally, some people would like to diversify some of that portfolio into a more stable format. And when they found out what's the value prop of stablecoins, they became very, very popular in LATAM. And then we created our USDC stablecoin savings account, which is actually where a lot of the disbursements are going these days. So a client in Venezuela or Colombia will apply for a loan. They will request the funds to be dispersed right into their USDC account. They will then use that USDC to either settle directly with someone in USDC or convert into Bolívares and then settle with them.
Wow. So you are able to essentially provide loans for people outside your country. That's kind of a crazy concept.
It's the coolest thing about our business. I think it's one of those, people talk about Bitcoin leveling the playing field, and we get to see it in real time, because we will process a loan for a Mexican client in the same time, speed, rates, and quality of service that we do an American loan or a Canadian loan. And I don't think any other financial institution can say that, which is something that I think is one of the coolest things about this business.
Yeah, I never really considered this aspect, because in a sense we're all used to loans being closed off by borders. But I mean, with Bitcoin, you can essentially do the same thing across borders. You could potentially lend to people in Japan or something like that, and not really be a problem, because you have this digital collateral that you can use to do this transaction. And especially if you have stable coins on the other side, and if that's sort of freely traded, then there's it works out for everybody. You don't need to have it all be in one country.
That's 100% right. And again, that is why, I think we and perhaps others in the space have been able to grow so fast, is the fact that this product, everybody in Latin America, not everybody, but a lot of people in Latin America prefer, if they could, to hold their money in a North American financial entity, because there is a big deal of foreign favoritism when it comes to financial entities in an emerging world, just because your local banks have gone down so many times that my grandfather, for example, lost all of his savings in the last Venezuelan bank that went under, Banco Latino. And since then, there's been a few others that have gone under. Ask someone from Argentina that question. And everybody will tell you, if I had the choice to hold my dollars at Ledn or at Banco de Venezuela or Banco de Colombia or Banco de Mexico, they would likely say Ledn, because they feel that they can trust, the way we're regulated, the oversight, the consumer protection rules that we have to follow many times are stronger than the local ones.
And in a sense, they can protect themselves from the theft by government, by inflation. So they're very happy to, use these foreign services where they have better property rights in a sense. That's what it seems like.
100%. And I mean, you can ask this to, anyone else or any other guest, but most wealth in Latin America is held in Florida. And that is not new. And I think that's a pattern that maybe won't necessarily change with Bitcoin. Like, it will change in the sense that a lot more people can do self-custody now. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in a particular country. It could be with you, right? But to the extent that the portfolio gets large enough and people need to have sort of management services, I think those clients will continue to favor investor markets. So like Canada, US, Europe, some parts of Europe.
That's so interesting that you have this international finance that's available, because really before that you didn't have the ability to, say, arbitrage loans against each other and stuff. Like, you can get loans for like 1% in Japan for a long time, but like nobody could really take advantage of it because of the currency fluctuations and stuff. Instead, like, if you had sort of like liquidity across markets that you can now with Bitcoin, like how much of that would change, and, would quantitative easing essentially cause like inflation faster because of the liquidity going out of or that the money printing kind of being available to more places through arbitrage?
Yeah, it's I think that Bitcoin is going to play, to be honest with you, I'm actually also surprised that this concept of Bitcoin being global collateral is not necessarily being blown up enough. Like, to me, it's it is the reason why I haven't been able to stop thinking about Bitcoin since I was able to transact back in the day when my brother sent me that first Bitcoin. It's this idea that you can sell it in any market condition to basically anyone, and you can transfer it from anywhere to anywhere, and it's the same one. Like, I completely agree with you. And going back to this idea of Bitcoin being an equalizer, so we see this at Ledn today. So most of the clients that use our savings accounts, which are clients that are looking to earn extra interest, not surprisingly come from investor markets, right? And so, proportionally speaking, the more US clients have money they want to earn interest on than need for loans, because a lot of US clients can get really great rates for credit. They have great access to credit and great rates for credit. Not the case in Latin America. So what we see is we have a lot of clients using our savings accounts that are from, call it, wealthy countries. And we can use or access that capital to then turn around and lend it to the clients that don't have access to credit, whose challenges are perhaps different. And so we've become this sort of coordinator, I would say, or not coordinator, but like it's a place where things can get balanced. It's like an escape valve, right? Where extra money can look for yield, and people that need extra credit can access credit, and we can kind of pair the two and sit in the middle.
Yeah, that is interesting, because you're essentially allowing this arbitrage to happen where, you have loans that are very, very cheap in certain countries and loans that are very expensive in others. And you're able, through Bitcoin, essentially having Bitcoin backing, you can loan out from the cheaper interest countries to the higher interest countries, and everybody wins there, except maybe the central banks, because they are not getting the benefits of local inflation the way they think they are.
So I'll give you one funny story. And this is a story that I think reflects some of our values at Ledn. One time, one VC, who we will not name, once asked us the same question. They were saying, so wait a second, you guys are lending money to people in Latin America? And we said, yes. And they said, and are you charging them the same rates as the people in North America? And we said, yes. And they're like, couldn't you charge them more just because they don't have access to capital? And we were like, we likely could, but that completely misses the point of what we're trying to do. And needless to say, they're not an investor in Ledn. We did not basically allow them to come in.
And it's not like you have a special formula. It's like if you did charge a higher rate, somebody will just undercut you anyway.
We want to be this in the long term. We want to be in this business for the long term. And the only way we can do that is by offering great products that are very competitive and by being upfront, honest, and transparent with what we can do and what we can't do. And that's served us well thus far. And, it's what we want to continue to do. We want to continue working only with people that are aligned with what our vision, I guess, and where we want to take it.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating how it's sort of democratized finance in many ways. It's, you're arbitraging, people, instead of investment bankers and the FX offices, taking advantage of this stuff. It's like you bring it to the common man, basically.
Our version of democratizing finance is a little bit different than throwing confetti when you buy options.
Yeah.
But no, I do, I appreciate you saying that. And I think to a great degree, that is the mission that we would love to be seen as playing and helping with, which is we want to bring a product that hopefully can help a lot of people and can be a Canadian politician said this, and I thought it was a really beautiful line. He says, an entrepreneur needs to be the most empathetic person in a city, because for an entrepreneur, when you go in and say you're going into a restaurant, when you buy a sandwich from a restaurant, the person buying that sandwich is happy to pay $5 for that sandwich because to them, it's worth more than $5. And the person selling the sandwich is also happy to sell it at $5 because to them, it costs less than $5. So the seller of the sandwich has to put themselves in the shoes of the buyer, and the buyer has to put themselves in the shoes of the seller. So any business transaction takes a great deal of empathy. And to your point, our business works because the rates we offer to the people that are savers are better than what they can get elsewhere. And the rates that we offer to the people that are borrowers are greater than they can get elsewhere. And the service element in those two is also better than they can get elsewhere.
Wow, good stuff. Well, so I think we've talked a lot about the actual business and everything else. Where can people find you? Where can people contact you?
So you can find us at Ledn.io. It's our website. You can learn more about, at Hodl with Ledn is our social media account. My personal account is at Cryptonomista. So Cryptonomist with an A at the end is my Twitter account. And my email is Mauricio@Ledn.io.
Thank you. Well, thanks for coming on and giving us, I think, what is certainly a very different perspective than the typical Western world one, especially given your experience.
No, I really appreciate you having me on, and it's been a really great chat. I'm also a big fan of all the work that you've done, so I just wanted to say it. That thank you for everything you've done for the community. I think people say it enough. So, yeah. When the books are written, we'll continue to be on them. So it's a pleasure to have been here.
Well, thank you.
Unchained Capital is a sponsor of this podcast. I'm an advisor to the company. I know the team well, and I'm excited for what they are building. If you need multi-sig, collaborative custody, or a Bitcoin native financial services partner, learn more at unchained.com. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Bitcoin Fixes This. Mauricio can be found at HODL with Ledn on Twitter and Ledn.io. Until next time, fiat delenda est.